The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across a quiet suburban street. Children laughed as they played on sidewalks lined with modest homes. Neighbors exchanged polite greetings, their voices carrying faintly through the crisp air. Beneath this calm exterior, however, an undercurrent of tension simmered. Mr. Jameson Rivers adjusted the grocery bags in his arms, careful not to let the handles dig too deeply into his weathered hands. His steps were slow but steady as he made his way home. He had lived here for decades, raised a family, taught generations of students before retiring. This neighborhood was familiar, comfortable. Yet today something felt off. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a patrol car idling at the curb ahead. The officer inside watched him intently, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Mr. Rivers tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the rhythmic sound of his footsteps. But when the car began to move, creeping forward like a predator stalking its prey, unease settled in his chest. "Evenin', sir," came a voice behind him, abrupt and commanding. Mr. Rivers turned slowly, his heart already racing. Detective Marcus Hale stood there, tall and imposing, one hand resting casually on the grip of his holstered weapon. "Mind if I ask what you're doing out here?" "I'm walking home," Mr. Rivers replied evenly, though his pulse quickened. "I live 2 blocks down." Hale's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the older man up and down. "Got ID on you? Just need to verify who you are." Mr. Rivers hesitated, then shifted the bags awkwardly to one arm so he could reach for his wallet. "Of course." His voice remained calm, measured. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped?" "No reason yet," Hale said, stepping closer. "Just routine. Can't be too careful these days. Routine." The word stung more than any insult could have. Mr. Rivers handed over his license, meeting Hale's gaze with quiet dignity. "This address checks out," Hale muttered after glancing at the card. But rather than handing it back, he tucked it into his pocket. "Still, you understand why I'd want to make sure everything's above board." "Above board?" Mr. Rivers repeated, incredulity creeping into his tone. "Officer, I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been alive. I'm simply trying to get home." But Hale wasn't listening. Instead, he gestured toward the bags in Mr. Rivers' arms. "What's all this? Anything in there worth checking out?" "Groceries," Mr. Rivers said simply. "Food for dinner. Would you like me to unpack them for you?" For a moment, Hale seemed taken aback by the sarcasm. Then his expression hardened. "Don't get smart with me, old man. You're making this harder than it needs to be." The words hit like a slap. Mr. Rivers clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to snap. But experience had taught him that arguing rarely ended well, so he stood there, silent and still, as Hale circled him like a hawk, sizing up its prey. "You know," Hale continued, his tone dripping with condescension, "people around here don't take kindly to strangers poking around, especially ones who look like they don't belong." "And what exactly does belonging look like, officer?" Mr. Rivers asked softly, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. "Does it mean having lighter skin? Living somewhere else? Or is it simply about doing what you say without question?" Hale didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Mr. Rivers roughly by the arm, twisting it behind his back. Pain shot through the elderly man's shoulder, forcing a gasp from his lips. The grocery bag slipped from his grasp, spilling oranges and bread onto the ground. "Hey, what's going on here?" someone shouted from across the street. Others joined in, their voices rising in confusion and anger. "Nothing to see here," Hale barked, though his grip faltered ever so slightly. For the first time since the encounter began, uncertainty flickered across his face. Mr. Rivers closed his eyes, drawing strength from the murmurs of support around him. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation, he refused to break, because deep down he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. As the crowd grew louder, demanding answers, a young woman pushed her way to the front, holding a phone aloft. "Let him go," she demanded, her voice firm. "We're watching." For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. And then, almost imperceptibly, Hale released his hold on Mr. Rivers. He stepped back, muttering something about finishing paperwork. But the damage was done. The seeds of resistance had been planted, not just in Mr. Rivers, but in everyone who bore witness. Later, as Mr. Rivers knelt to gather his scattered groceries, a neighbor approached cautiously. "Are you okay, Mr. Rivers?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. He nodded, managing a small smile despite the ache in his body. "I'll be fine," he said. "Thank you for standing up." She hesitated, then placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We should have done more sooner, but we won't stay silent again." In that moment, surrounded by faces both familiar and new, Mr. Rivers felt a spark of hope ignite within him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him that change, real, lasting change, was possible. All it took was courage. The news spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed with notifications, and whispers filled the air as neighbors shared updates about what had happened on their quiet street. Social media posts exploded with outrage. Photos of an elderly black man handcuffed on the ground, surrounded by officers, sparked fury in the community. The hashtag Justice for Rivers began trending almost instantly. People were angry, scared, but most of all, they were ready to act. Maya Rivers felt her phone vibrate against her desk for the third time in under a minute. She glanced at the screen, her stomach sinking as she read the text. "They got Dad." Her heart raced as she grabbed her bag and bolted out of her office, ignoring the protests of colleagues calling after her. The drive home was a blur of red lights and clenched fists. Every second felt like an eternity. Fear clawed at her chest, but beneath it burned something hotter. Anger. Anger that this was happening again. Anger that no matter how hard she fought, the system always seemed to win. When Maya arrived, the scene hit her like a punch to the gut. There he was, her father, Mr. Jameson Rivers, kneeling on the cold pavement, his hands cuffed behind his back. His usually proud posture was slumped, his face etched with humiliation. For a moment, Maya froze, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't just her father. This was every black person who had ever been stripped of their dignity by those sworn to protect them. It took everything she had not to scream. The officers noticed her immediately. One of them whispered something to Detective Marcus Hale, whose smug expression faltered when he realized who had just stepped onto the scene. Maya Rivers wasn't just any lawyer. She was a force to be reckoned with, known for dismantling cases of police misconduct. Her presence shifted the energy instantly. The crowd murmured, emboldened by her arrival. Even Hale seemed uneasy, though he tried to mask it. "Let him go," Maya demanded, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Now!" Hale straightened, attempting to assert dominance. "Miss Rivers, I suggest you stay out of this. Your father is being detained for reasonable suspicion." "Reasonable suspicion," Maya shot back, incredulous. "Of what? Walking while black? Carrying groceries? Or just existing in a world where people like you think you can treat us however you want?" Her words hung heavy in the air. Neighbors nodded in agreement, some shouting encouragement from behind her. Maya's mind raced with memories, flashes of her childhood, watching her father endure similar indignities. She remembered sitting in the car as a teenager, gripping the steering wheel while her dad talked calmly to yet another officer who had pulled him over for no reason. Back then, she promised herself she would fight back someday. Now, here she was. Mr. Rivers looked up at his daughter, his eyes filled with shame. "Maya," he began weakly, but she cut him off. "No, Dad," she said firmly, kneeling beside him. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone. Not today, not ever." Inside, Maya wrestled with conflicting emotions. Fury boiled within her, not just at Hale, but at herself. Why hadn't she been there sooner? Guilt gnawed at her, but determination quickly took its place. She wouldn't let this stand. Not now, not ever. Detective Hale attempted to justify his actions, stumbling over vague phrases like suspicious behavior and protocol. But Maya wasn't having it. With calm precision, she dismantled each excuse, exposing the flimsy foundation of his claims. "You stopped my father because he's black," she said bluntly, her voice cutting through the tension. "Don't insult our intelligence by pretending otherwise." The growing crowd amplified the pressure. Some shouted accusations at the officers, others filmed the confrontation, their phones held high like weapons of accountability. The atmosphere grew volatile, charged with raw emotion. Through it all, Maya remained focused, her words sharp and deliberate. She knew this wasn't just about her father. It was about every person who had been failed by the system. As the confrontation escalated, Maya caught glimpses of her father's quiet despair. He sat silently, grappling with feelings of betrayal. All his life he had believed in respecting authority, trusting that the law would protect him if he played by the rules. Now, that belief lay shattered. Maya saw the weight of it in his eyes, and it broke her heart. But it also fueled her resolve. Through Maya's observations, the broader reality of systemic racism came into focus. This wasn't just about one bad cop or one unjust arrest. It was about policies that perpetuated inequality, cultural norms that dehumanized entire communities, and institutions that refused to change. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming injustice, Maya found hope. The crowd around her symbolized collective resistance, a community united in outrage, refusing to stay silent. Finally, reinforcements arrived, a mix of higher-ranking officials and local activists, alerted to the unfolding drama. Their presence forced Hale to retreat temporarily, but the battle was far from over. As the immediate tension eased, Maya turned to her father, helping him to his feet. "We'll get through this," she assured him, her voice soft but unwavering. "Together." In that moment, seeds of resilience were planted, not just in Maya and her father, but in everyone who witnessed the confrontation. Though challenges remained, the fight for justice had only just begun. Detective Marcus Hale's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You're making this worse for yourself, Rivers," he said, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Obstruction of justice is a serious charge." Maya stepped forward, her heart pounding but her expression unyielding. She locked eyes with Hale, refusing to let him intimidate her or her father. "Obstruction," she shot back, her voice ringing with authority. "My father was walking home from the grocery store when you decided to treat him like a criminal. That's not obstruction. That's injustice." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices swelling like an approaching storm. Maya could feel their energy behind her, a tide of outrage and solidarity that pushed her forward. Cameras flashed and phones recorded every word, capturing the moment for the world to see. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about all the lives touched by systemic racism. Taking a deep breath, Maya turned to address not only the officers, but also the growing audience of neighbors, activists, and bystanders. Her words came slowly at first, deliberate and measured, as if weighing each syllable before releasing it into the charged air. "For too long," she began, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Black people have been dehumanized by those who are supposed to protect us. We've been told we don't belong in our own neighborhoods, that carrying groceries makes us suspicious, that simply existing while black is enough to justify harassment. But I'm here to tell you, we won't stay silent anymore." Her speech gained momentum, her passion igniting a fire in everyone listening. "This isn't just about my father. It's about every parent who has had to teach their child how to act around police out of fear for their life. It's about every person who has been stopped, searched, or brutalized because of the color of their skin. And it's about the erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they're meant to serve. If we want change, we need accountability." As Maya spoke, Mr. Jameson Rivers struggled to his feet, brushing off the dirt and indignity clinging to him. For a moment he wavered, his frail body betraying the weight of what he'd endured. But then he straightened, standing tall beside his daughter. His presence alone was a statement, a quiet declaration of resilience and strength. Together, they faced Detective Hale, refusing to be cowed. "You can try to silence us," Maya continued, her voice rising, "but you can't stop the truth. You can't erase the stories of countless others who have suffered because of your prejudice. So go ahead, charge him, charge me. But know this, we will fight back, and we will win." The younger officer standing beside Hale shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between Maya and the crowd. There was something in his posture, a flicker of doubt, perhaps even shame, that hadn't been there before. He glanced at Hale, then quickly looked away, unable to reconcile the orders he'd been given with the humanity unfolding before him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to crack the facade of invincibility surrounding the police force. The crowd held its collective breath, the tension thick enough to choke on. Some clutched their phones tighter, recording every second, while others clenched their fists, ready to intervene if things escalated further. The standoff teetered on the edge of chaos, uncertainty rippling through the air like heat waves. Just as it seemed violence might erupt, reinforcements arrived. Higher-ranking officials and local activists stepping onto the scene. Their presence shifted the balance of power instantly. Hale stiffened, his bravado faltering under the scrutiny of both the crowd and his superiors. Reluctantly, he took a step back, muttering something about handling this later, before retreating slightly. A ripple of relief passed through the crowd, though it was fleeting. No one believed the battle was over. They knew better than to think justice would come easily. Still, there was a brief moment of triumph, a shared understanding that they had stood together and forced the system to blink. Maya placed a hand on her father's shoulder, squeezing gently. "We did it," she whispered, though her tone carried more resolve than celebration. "For now." Mr. Rivers nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I never thought," he started, his voice trembling. "I never thought I'd live to see a day where people would stand up for me like this." "It's not just for you, Dad," Maya replied softly. "It's for everyone who's ever been made to feel small. Today we showed them that we're stronger together." In that moment, seeds of hope were planted. Though the road ahead remained fraught with challenges, the community had taken a stand. They had confronted prejudice head-on, refusing to let fear dictate their actions. And as the crowd began to disperse, their voices still echoing in the night, it was clear that this was only the beginning of a larger movement, a fight for justice that would continue until true equality was achieved. Maya sat at her desk, the glow of her laptop casting soft light across stacks of papers and legal documents. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she began drafting the formal complaint against Detective Marcus Hale. Each keystroke felt deliberate, a small but significant step toward accountability. She knew this wasn't just about her father. It was about sending a message that no one was above justice. "This is only the beginning," Maya whispered to herself, leaning back in her chair for a moment. The weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on her chest, but there was clarity now, too. Clarity and purpose. The next morning, Maya stood before a group of neighbors gathered in the community center. Some faces were familiar, others she'd never seen before. All of them carried stories etched into their expressions, stories of pain, frustration, and resilience. Maya took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium tightly. "What happened to my father isn't unique," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "It's part of a pattern, a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. But we have the power to change that." Her words ignited something in the room. One by one, people began sharing their own experiences. A young mother recounted being pulled over repeatedly while driving through predominantly white neighborhoods. An elderly man spoke of being followed in stores simply because of his skin color. A teenager described how fear of police had shaped every decision he made when leaving the house. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of collective outrage and hope. Afterward, Maya approached her father, who sat quietly near the back of the room. His hands rested on his knees, trembling slightly, but his eyes held a spark she hadn't seen in days. "Dad," she said softly, sitting beside him. How are you holding up?" Mr. Rivers looked at her, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time I did more than just survive this world. Maybe it's time I helped others navigate it." Over the following weeks, Mr. Rivers found new purpose. He started mentoring young people in the neighborhood, teaching them not just about history or academics, but about resilience and self-worth. "You deserve respect," he told them during one session, his voice firm yet gentle. "Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." The kids listened intently, hanging onto his every word. In their eyes, he saw reflections of himself. Young, uncertain, searching for strength, and in turn, they gave him strength. Meanwhile, Maya reflected deeply on the cyclical nature of racism. Sitting alone on her porch one evening, she stared out at the quiet street where everything had unfolded. "It's like a chain," she murmured aloud, as if trying to untangle the thought. "One link leads to another, generation after generation. Breaking free means breaking that cycle, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us." She thought about the countless acts of resistance she'd witnessed: a neighbor filming an unjust arrest, a teacher speaking out against biased curriculum, even strangers standing together in solidarity. Every act mattered, no matter how small. Change doesn't happen overnight, she reminded herself, but every effort counts. A few days later, Maya and Mr. Rivers attended a community meeting focused on improving relationships with law enforcement. Residents filled the room, their voices rising and falling in passionate discussion. Some argued for stricter oversight of officers. Others suggested training programs to address implicit bias. Though disagreements flared occasionally, the overall tone remained hopeful. People were invested in their safety, their dignity, their future. As the meeting drew to a close, Maya stood to address the group once more. "We won't solve everything tonight," she admitted, her voice warm with sincerity. "But look around you. Look at what we've built here. A community united by courage and love. That's how we'll create a better world. Together." When they returned home, Maya noticed her father smiling faintly as he gazed out the window. "Do you think we'll ever see real change?" he asked quietly. "I do," Maya replied without hesitation. "Because we're already changing things. Every story shared, every act of resistance, every bridge built, it all adds up. We're building a world worth fighting for." And as they stood side by side, bathed in the golden light of sunset, both father and daughter felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but they weren't walking it alone. Together, alongside their community, they were planting seeds of transformation, one courageous step at a time.